The engine died the instant the wheels touched the deck. Not sputtered, not coughed, died. And in that silence, sitting strapped into a dark blue Grumman Hellcat on the wrong carrier's flight deck, Commander David McCampbell of Bessemer, Alabama, was about to learn whether the United States Navy would give him the Medal of Honor or a general court-martial. The propeller had stopped turning. 3 blades frozen against the tropical sky like the hands of a clock that had just given up on time. Commander McCampbell sat strapped into the cockpit of his Grumman F6F5 Hellcat, dark blue paint scorched from 90 minutes of continuous combat, and listened to the silence where 2,000 horses should have been roaring. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 in front of him had run bone, dry the instant his tail hook caught the arresting wire. The flight deck of the light carrier USS Langley stretched out around him, sailors sprinting toward the aircraft, but McCampbell was not looking at them. He was staring at the fuel gauge. 0. Absolute 0. Not a vapor, not a drop. The ordnance chief would climb onto his wing in a few minutes and open each of the 6 ammunition bays. He would count 6 rounds still in the starboard outboard gun, all 6 jammed. That was what Commander McCampbell had brought home from the sky above the Philippine Sea. 6 bullets, an empty fuel tank, and a scorecard that would never be equaled in the history of United States naval aviation. Behind him, somewhere over the horizon, the greatest naval engagement ever fought was still unfolding. 200,000 men, 26 Japanese warships that would rest on the bottom of the ocean within 72 hours, battleships as large as small cities, escort carriers charging heavy cruisers head-on, and one 34-year-old commander from Bessemer, Alabama, sitting in a dead airplane on somebody else's carrier, wondering whether he had just won the Medal of Honor or a general court-martial. To understand how David McCampbell got here, you have to go back 90 minutes. October 24th, 1944. Dawn breaking over the Philippine Sea. Task Group 38.3 steaming on station east of Luzon under the flag of Rear Admiral Frederick Carl Sherman, one of the 4 fast carrier groups that made up Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 38. 4 carriers turned into the wind, cruisers and destroyers cutting white wakes through dark water. And at the center of the formation, 27,000 tons of American steel called the USS Essex, hull number CV9. On her flight deck, aircraft handlers had been working since before first light. Curtiss Helldivers and Grumman Avengers were being spotted for the morning strike. The target was clear: Japanese airfields on Luzon. Neutralize the land-based air threat before the invasion beaches at Leyte, 150 miles to the south, could be hit again. Douglas MacArthur had waded ashore at Palau 4 days earlier. The promise of return had been kept. Now the Japanese combined fleet was steaming from 3 directions to break that promise, and Task Force 38 stood between them and the American beachhead. David McCampbell was 34 years old. He had been born on the 16th of January 1910 in Bessemer, Alabama, a mill town on the outskirts of Birmingham. His father owned a furniture store. His family had moved to West Palm Beach, Florida, when he was still a boy. He had attended Staunton Military Academy in Virginia. He had spent a year at Georgia Tech before receiving an appointment to the United States Naval Academy in 1929. He had graduated in the class of 1933 with a degree in marine engineering. And then the Great Depression had almost ended his naval career before it began. The Navy had no commissions for him. He had been placed on the reserve list and sent home. For a year, he had worked construction jobs in Atlanta and part-time at an aircraft assembly plant, watching other men fly the airplanes he wanted to build. When his commission finally came through in 1934, he grabbed it with both hands and never let go. He had earned his wings at Pensacola in 1938. He had served with Fighting Squadron 4 aboard the carrier USS Ranger. He had been a landing signal officer aboard the carrier USS Wasp, hull number CV-7, on the night of the 15th of September 1942, when 3 torpedoes from the submarine 19 struck her starboard side south of Guadalcanal. The Wasp had burned for hours. Nearly 200 crew died. McCampbell had survived and gone home to teach other pilots how to land on carriers. By February of 1944, he was a full commander in charge of Air Group 15, the fabled 15, embarked aboard the USS Essex. In 5 months of combat, he had accumulated 21 confirmed kills. He had become an ace in a single day at the Marianas, Turkey shoot the previous June, downing 5 Yokosuka Judy dive bombers before lunch and 2 Mitsubishi Zeros before dinner. The Navy had printed his photograph in every recruiting brochure they could distribute. Newspapers back home called him Dashing Dave. His airplane was named Minsi III. She wore 21 small Japanese flags stenciled below her cockpit rail, Bureau number 70143. A Grumman F6F5 Hellcat, dark navy blue, white stars, 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, spread across her wings. The name was for a girl he had known back in Florida. The number 3 meant she was the 3rd airplane he had named for her. The first 2 had been retired or written off. On the morning of the 24th of October, Minsi III was not scheduled to fly. She sat on the Essex flight deck near the island, partially fueled, waiting to be pushed forward for the second morning strike. Her plane captain had begun topping off her main tank. The fueling was maybe half complete when the ship's loudspeakers began to squawk. Because 120 miles to the west, on the airfields of Luzon, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi had just made a decision that would kill hundreds of his own pilots and change the war forever. Onishi commanded the 1st Air Fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy. His aircraft were land-based, scattered across the fields at Clark, Manila, and half a dozen dirt strips north to Apari. His mission that morning was simple: find the American carriers, sink them. If conventional attacks failed, he already had another plan in his pocket, a plan he would announce to the first volunteers within days. He would call it the Divine Wind, the Special Attack Corps, the Kamikaze. But on the morning of October 24th, Onishi was still trying to do it the traditional way. He launched 3 waves of attack aircraft, one after the other, roughly 50 to 60 planes in each wave: Zeros, Nakajima Oscars, Judy dive bombers, Betty medium bombers, everything he had. All of them turned east toward the American task force. The first wave was engaged by Combat Air Patrol Hellcats 30 miles out. Most of the Japanese aircraft never made it through, but one Yokosuka D4Y3 Judy dive bomber slipped through the melee, alone, unnoticed, low over the water. She flew directly at Task Group 38.3. She picked out the light carrier USS Princeton, hull number CVL-23. At 9:38 in the morning, she released one 550-pound armor-piercing bomb from 3,000 feet. The bomb punched through the flight deck, through the hangar bay, and detonated inside the ammunition storage. Fire erupted through the ship. 6 fully fueled and armed Avenger torpedo bombers began cooking off in the hangar. Princeton shuddered like a struck animal. Black smoke poured from her wounds and climbed 5,000 feet into the tropical sky. That was the warning. That was what one Japanese airplane could do. 12 minutes later, at 9:50 in the morning, The Combat Information Center, high in the island of the Essex, flickered with new radar returns. A second wave, larger than the first, was inbound from the west. 50 aircraft, maybe 60, stacked from 1,000 feet above the waves up to 25,000. The squawk box in the ready room came alive. All available fighter pilots, man your planes. All available fighter pilots, man your planes. David McCampbell was in the ready room when the call came. He looked up from the coffee cup in his hand. He was the commander of Air Group 15. He was the most publicly famous naval aviator in the United States Navy. He was, by any reading of the term, not an available fighter pilot. Earlier that same morning, Rear Admiral Sherman had told him so directly. Sherman had personally forbidden McCampbell from leading the dawn strike. 21 kills, ace, in a day, face of naval aviation. Sherman had used the phrase too valuable. It had been an order delivered face-to-face from a two-star admiral to a full commander. It was not a suggestion. McCampbell set his coffee cup down. He walked out of the ready room. He crossed the passage and climbed the ladder to the flight deck. Minsi III was still sitting near the island, the fueling half done. Her plane captain was already sprinting toward her. The flight officer on deck had made his own calculation. Without McCampbell, Essex had only 5 Hellcats immediately ready to launch against a wave of 60. With him, 6. The flight officer needed the airplane airborne or below deck, one or the other, immediately. There was no more time to fuel her. McCampbell reached the aircraft. He looked at the gauge on the side of the fuselage, roughly half full. Maybe 130 gallons in a plane that normally carried 250. Enough for about 90 minutes of cruise flight. Less than 60 if he had to fight. He climbed onto the wing. The plane captain looked at him. There was a question in the sailor's eyes, and it was not about mechanical readiness. It was about whether the commander understood what he was about to do. Sherman's order was not a matter of interpretation. Disobeying it in front of the entire flight deck would end his career. McCampbell swung his leg over the cockpit rail and dropped into the seat. He plugged in his radio cord. He fastened his harness. He looked out across the deck at the 5 other Hellcats already spinning up. Then he keyed his intercom to the plane captain and gave a single short answer to a question no one had asked. Available. The plane captain nodded, stepped back and cleared the wing. The propeller began to turn. 22 miles to the west, 60 Japanese aircraft continued east at 200 knots, closing the distance toward the American carriers. The clock in the Essex Combat Information Center read 9:53. David McCampbell had 90 minutes ahead of him. 90 minutes to fly one of the most extraordinary hours in the history of aerial combat, and every man aboard Task Group 38.3 was about to bet his life on the fuel he did not have. The R-2800 caught fire on the third revolution. 18 cylinders coming alive, one after another, 2 rows of 9, the sound climbing from a stutter to a growl to a bellow, 2,000 horsepower shaking the aircraft on her main gear. David McCampbell adjusted his throttle, watched the manifold pressure needles stabilize, and looked forward down the deck of the USS Essex. 6 Hellcats were airborne ahead of him. He was the 7th. He had never been assigned to that launch. He was simply there. The launch officer dropped his flag. McCampbell released the brakes and shoved the throttle to the stop. Minsi III rolled down the wooden deck, gathered speed against the 20-knot wind curling over the bow, and lifted off with the engine still trimmed for climb power. The gear folded up into the wings. The horizon tilted as he banked left and began climbing to join the others. His fuel gauge read half full. Every foot of altitude he stole from the sky burned fuel he did not have to burn. He kept climbing anyway. Ensign Roy Rushing formed up on his right wing at 3,000 feet. Rushing was young, quiet, dark-haired, a section leader with maybe a dozen combat sorties to his name. He was not a legend. He was not on any recruiting poster. What he was disciplined. What he was exactly where he was supposed to be, 500 feet off his section leader's starboard wingtip, throttle matched, altitude matched, guns armed and ready. The 5 other Hellcats spread into a loose combat formation ahead of them. McCampbell keyed his radio and identified himself to the fighter director aboard, Essex. The reply came back in a calm voice from the Combat Information Center. Vector 270, bogies 22 miles, angels 1 to 25. Multiple contacts, multiple altitudes. McCampbell rolled onto the heading and pushed his throttle forward. He kept climbing. At 12,000 feet, the Philippine Sea spread out below him like a sheet of hammered blue steel. To the south, the smoke column from the burning Princetons still climbed into the sky, a black smear that would eventually reach 12,000 feet in its own right. To the west, invisible for the moment, but growing closer by the second, 60 Japanese airplanes were flying east at 200 knots. He climbed through 15,000, then 18, then 20,000 feet. He knew the zero. He had fought them for 5 months. Below 14,000 feet, the Mitsubishi A6M could outclimb him, outturn him, and stay on his tail all the way through a scissors maneuver until his wings came off. Above 20,000 feet, the equation flipped. Up here, the Hellcat's superior weight and horsepower became a hammer. He could dive faster than any Japanese fighter in our sky. He could zoom back up to altitude and choose his next target. He could fight this battle on his terms, or not at all. He climbed to 22,000 feet and leveled off. Rushing was still there, 500 feet to his right, exactly where he belonged. McCampbell saw the Japanese formation at 10:17. They were 12,000 feet below him, small dark specks against the ocean, dozens of them, spread out in a defensive gaggle that filled the sky for 2 miles in every direction. Zeros. Nakajima Ki 43 Oscars. A tight cluster of what looked like Betty bombers or Judy, dive bombers in the middle, protected by the fighters like a queen surrounded by her guards. He counted. He kept counting. He stopped counting. 60 aircraft, plus or minus 5. Approximately 40 fighter escorts. The rest were the strike element, and the strike element was the reason this whole thing existed. The bombers were what would kill the Essex. The bombers were what would finish what the lone Judy had started against the Princeton. The fighters existed only to keep him from getting to the bombers. McCampbell keyed his radio and split his division. He told the 5 Hellcats ahead of him to go after the strike element. Get the bombers. Break them up before they reach the ships. He and Rushing would take the escort. 2 against 40. There was no argument on the radio. There was no time. The 5 Hellcats peeled off and dove for the bombers. McCampbell watched them go, then rolled Minsi III onto her right wing and began his own attack from 12,000 feet above the Japanese fighter cover. Rushing followed 30 seconds behind him, holding his position, holding his discipline. What happened next, in the sky over the Philippine Sea, was not a dogfight. A dogfight is 2 men turning inside each other's circles at low altitude, wrestling for a firing solution, ending in a scissors, or a stall, or a flat spin. A dogfight is what killed pilots. What McCampbell did that morning was something older and colder. He hunted. He picked his first target on the way down. A 0 on the outer edge of the escort screen, slightly separated from the main formation. oblivious. The Zero pilot never looked up. Nobody in the Japanese formation had thought to look up yet. They were watching the 5 Hellcats diving on the bombers below them. They were arguing on their own radios about who should turn back. McCampbell centered the Zero in his Mk-8 illuminated reflector sight at 800 yards, then 600, then 400. His airspeed indicator wound passed 350 knots. The Zero grew from a speck to a shape to an airplane with rising sun markings on the wings. He pressed the trigger for 1 second. 6.50 caliber Brownings opened up in a shuddering roar he could feel through his boots. 50 rounds. The Zero's right wing folded upward, tore away from the fuselage at the root, and separated. The remainder of the airplane rolled inverted, nosed over, and began a long, slow, tumbling fall toward the ocean 4 miles below. First kill for McCampbell. First Zero. He pulled up hard. 4 Gs pressed him into his seat. He climbed back to altitude. He did not look to see whether the Zero pilot bailed out. He was already picking his next target. Off to his left, Rushing had done the same thing. Another Zero was falling toward the Philippine Sea in pieces. Rushing had scored 2. The wingman would keep scoring all morning long. Alongside his section leader, a private tally running parallel to the record McCampbell was about to set. Now the Japanese formation knew they were being attacked from above. The neat defensive gap broke apart. Zeros scattered in every direction. Some climbed, some dove, some tried to turn into the threat. And here is the first hard truth of the day. Somewhere down there, one of those Japanese formation leaders looked at the 5 Hellcats coming for his bombers, looked at the dead escort spinning toward the water, looked at the smoke still climbing from Princeton on the horizon, and made a decision. He waved the bombers off. The entire strike element turned around. The bombers, the Bettys, and the Judys, the aircraft that had been the whole point of the mission, banked west and started back toward Luzon without ever releasing a single bomb. The 5 Hellcats down below had a straightforward job for the next few minutes. Keep them going home. Do not let them turn around. The bombers ran, but the fighter escort could not run. 40 of them were now spread out between 12,000 and 18,000 feet, and above them, at 22,000 feet, 2 dark blue Grumman Hellcats were rolling in for the next attack. McCampbell picked a second Zero. Same altitude advantage, same slashing dive, same short burst. The Zero pilots saw him coming this time, and he did what Zero pilots always did. He pulled straight up into a climbing turn to meet the threat head-on. Below 14,000 feet, the Zero would have out-climbed him. Up here, it did not matter. McCampbell was already diving at 380 knots. The Zero was flat and slow. He put the pipper of his gun sight on the Japanese engine, cowling, and fired. The Zero's canopy shattered. The airplane's snap rolled left and fell away. No fire, just gravity taking over from a dead man. Second Zero, second kill. Rushing was there off to his left, climbing back up alongside him, matching his altitude, ready for the next pass. McCampbell rolled inverted, pulled through, and dove again. A Nakajima Oscar this time, the Key 43, Army fighter. Onishi was mixing Army units into his naval attack because he had run out of naval pilots. The Oscar was faster than a Zero in some conditions, but she was made of tissue paper. She carried no armor behind the pilot. She carried no self-sealing fuel tanks. She caught fire the way dry grass catches fire. McCampbell hit her from 600 yards with a 2-second burst. The Oscar's fuselage tank ruptured. A ball of orange flame swallowed the airplane whole. She came apart in the air, pieces of her drifting down through the tropical sky, trailing black smoke. There was no parachute. Third kill. First Oscar. McCampbell glanced at his fuel gauge as he climbed back to altitude. The needle had already dropped from half tank to 1/4. Every full throttle climb was drinking his fuel. He was still 80 miles from the American task force. The math was starting to whisper. He kept fighting. Fourth kill at 10:39. Another 0. Same altitude advantage. Same firing solution. Same result. He worked through the Japanese formation like a farmer working through a wheat field. Dive, fire, climb, dive, fire, climb. Rushing stayed on his wing through every pass. His wingman was firing shorter bursts, smarter bursts, more economical with the 400 rounds per gun he had started with. Fifth kill at 10:44. Another 0, this one trying to run west when McCampbell caught him from above and behind. 50 rounds. The 0 came apart at the wing root. McCampbell's shoulders were beginning to ache from the G-forces. Sweat was running down the inside of his flight suit, despite the cold at 22,000 feet. His oxygen mask was slick against his face. The Brownings were heating up. He could smell the cordite through the mask. Between attacks, he made himself breathe slowly and check 3 things every single time. Altitude, fuel, rushing, 6th kill. A second Oscar this time. The Minsi III tried to break left when she saw the Hellcat rolling in from above. McCampbell led her by a full aircraft length and fired. The Oscar's canopy shattered. The pilot slumped forward. The airplane rolled onto her back and spun away toward the sea. 2 Oscars, 4 zeros, 6 kills, 7th kill. Another 0. McCampbell was barely counting anymore. The rhythm had taken over. Dive from 22,000, pick a target, 50 rounds, climb back to altitude, look for rushing, do it again. Now something changed. Rushing's Hellcat pulled up alongside him after a pass, and Rushing was making hand signals across the 50 feet of open sky between them. He tapped his machine gun sight. He drew a flat hand across his throat. Then he pointed at his fuel gauge and shrugged. Empty guns. Rushing had burned through all 2,400 of his rounds. He was at this altitude, over the Philippine Sea, in the middle of a fight, holding a fighter with no ammunition. McCampbell had a choice. The safe choice, the doctrine choice, the choice every training manual had told him for 8 years, was to break off and escort his defenseless wingman home. He looked at Rushing across the open sky. He held up one finger. Then he pointed down at a formation of zeros that was trying to reform 2,000 feet below them. Rushing understood immediately. A Hellcat with empty guns looked exactly like a Hellcat with full guns. If 2 of them dove on the Japanese would have to split their attention between 2 threats. Rushing's presence, his mere presence, would keep McCampbell alive for another attack run. And another, and another. Rushing nodded once. They dove together. 8th kill at 10:56. A 0 whose pilot spent the last 3 seconds of his life trying to figure out which of the 2 Hellcats was the real threat. By the time he committed to McCampbell had already put a burst of 50 caliber into his engine, and the 0 was falling. McCampbell's Brownings were down to less than 400 rounds. He had started the morning with 2,400. He had less than 15 minutes of fuel remaining at economy cruise, and he was still 90 miles from Essex. He looked for one more target. He found her at 11:08, a single 0, low, straight and level, running west toward Luzon. Her pilot had seen enough. Her pilot wanted to go home. McCampbell was 34 years old, and he had a wife back in the United States, and he had a mother in West Palm Beach, and he had 2 minutes of fuel to spare, and he chose to dive one more time. The 0 pilot saw him coming and tried to dive away. Wrong choice. A Hellcat could outdive anything in the Japanese inventory. McCampbell closed to 200 yards. He put the Pipper on the Zero's engine cowling. He squeezed the trigger for what would be the last extended burst of his day. Tracers walked up the Zero's spine from tail to nose. The engine seized in mid-air. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The Zero rolled inverted, nosed straight down, and disappeared into the overcast layer at 8,000 feet. 9th kill. 7th Zero. 2 Oscars and 7 zeros. 9 confirmed victories in a single mission by a single American naval aviator, a record that would stand for the rest of the war and every war after it. McCampbell keyed his radio for the first time since the fight had begun. He called Essex. He gave them a number. The radio operator on Essex asked him to repeat. McCampbell repeated. 9 confirmed. Then he looked at his fuel gauge and his blood went cold. The main tank read empty. The auxiliary tank read 1/8. Maybe 20 gallons. Maybe 30 minutes of flight if he throttled all the way back and glided most of the way home. 90 miles away, over the horizon, the American fleet was steaming east into the Philippine Sea. Between him and that fleet was 90 miles of open ocean. And, though he did not know it yet, a screen of American destroyers who had spent the last hour listening to reports of Japanese aircraft approaching from exactly the direction his Hellcat was now flying. He turned east. He pulled the throttle back to bare minimum cruise. He leaned the mixture until the R-2800 was almost coughing. Rushing pulled up on his right wing. The two of them, silhouetted against the noon sun over the Philippines, began the long glide home. Neither one of them knew that the worst part of the day was still ahead. The Pratt & Whitney was dying by inches. David McCampbell could hear it in the exhaust note. The R-2800 had run at full military power for the better part of 90 minutes. At altitudes it was never designed to sustain in tropical air that starved the cylinders of the cooling they needed. Now, throttled back to 1,600 RPM at 18,000 feet, the big radial was running rough, missing on at least one cylinder, coughing every few seconds like a man with something caught in his throat. McCampbell reached down and switched fuel tanks. The auxiliary showed 1/8. He set the mixture to full lean. He trimmed the airplane for maximum glide. To his right, Roy Rushing was flying formation on him at exactly the same power setting, exactly the same altitude, exactly the same airspeed. Rushing had a thin stream of white vapor trailing from his cowling. His oil temperature had to be climbing into the red. His engine was in worse shape than McCampbell's. Neither man said a word on the radio. They flew east. The sun climbed toward noon behind them. The Philippine Sea unrolled beneath their wings, blue and empty and unforgiving. McCampbell watched the fuel gauge. The needle was resting against the pin now, below the last mark on the dial, dropping into a region the engineers at Grumman had never bothered to calibrate. He began doing the arithmetic every pilot does when he knows he might not make it home. Every 1,000 feet of altitude was worth about 2 miles of dead stick glide. He was at 18,000 feet, 36 miles of gliding. If his prop kept windmilling and the R-2800 did not seize in the meantime, the Essex was 60 miles away. The math did not work. He kept flying anyway. At 8,000 feet, he could see the American fleet on the horizon. Small gray shapes against blue water, 4 carriers in a rough box, cruisers and destroyers in a screen around them, white wakes cutting through the sea. Home, close enough to touch. The first 5-inch shell burst 200 yards in front of him. A black puff of smoke. Then another one, closer. Then a third. So close, he heard the crump of the detonation over the sound of his own dying engine. McCampbell's stomach dropped. The destroyer screen was firing on him. The tin cans out on the picket line had picked up two aircraft approaching from the west, from the direction the Japanese always came from, and they were engaging. The IFF transponder in his Hellcat should have told the ships he was friendly. Transponders failed. Radar operators made mistakes. Nobody on the picket line was in the mood to take chances after what had happened to the Princeton. Another shell burst above him, close enough that he heard shrapnel rattle off his fuselage. McCampbell pushed the stick forward and dove for the wave tops. Rushing followed. Both Hellcats dropped through 6,000 feet in half a minute, spiraling down, jinking left and right to spoil the fire control solution on the destroyers below. The 5-inch bursts followed them all the way down, and then stopped when they got too low for the guns to depress any further. McCampbell leveled off at 300 feet above the ocean. He had traded his last altitude, his last reserve of energy, his last insurance policy, for survival against his own side. He looked up. 4 American Hellcats were diving on him from 10,000 feet. He knew what they were. He could see the markings. Fighter Squadron 19, off the USS Lexington, the Combat Air Patrol. They had been vectored by the destroyer screen to intercept 2 unidentified aircraft approaching the fleet from the west. The math on this one was simpler. If those 4 Hellcats got a firing pass, he and Rushing were dead. There was no ammunition left in his guns to fight back with. Even if there had been, he had no fuel to maneuver with, and no altitude to trade. He was flying an airplane that was 2 minutes from becoming a submarine. The 4 Hellcats closed to 1,000 yards. 800, 600. McCampbell could see the black openings of their gun ports. He did not turn. He did not run. He had nowhere to go. At 400 yards, the lead Hellcat pulled up. McCampbell would never know why. Maybe the pilot recognized the twin white bars painted on the fuselage of Air Group 15. Maybe someone in the Essex Combat Information Center had finally gotten through on the radio and identified the incoming aircraft as friendly. Maybe it was just a fighter pilot's instinct, that half-second of doubt when something on the target does not look quite right. The other 3 followed the leader up. They climbed away, banking off to the north, and disappeared into the haze. McCampbell exhaled. He had not realized he was holding his breath. 2 miles from the Essex, his engine quit. Complete power loss. The propeller kept turning, windmilling in the slipstream, but the R-2800 was silent. No thrust. No sound, but the wind over the canopy and the whistle of 11,000 pounds of Grumman iron gliding down toward the ocean at 120 knots. Sink rate 800 feet per minute. Altitude 1,000 feet. Distance to the Essex 2 miles. The math finished itself. He was going to hit the water 1 mile short of his own carrier. Then he looked to his right. USS Langley. Hull number CVL-27. A light carrier, smaller than Essex, older, less capable, but her flight deck was clear and she was steaming into the wind on his starboard side. 2 miles out and slightly closer than Essex. McCampbell put his nose on Langley and committed to the only landing he had left. He was at 800 feet, 1 mile out, sink rate increasing, 700, 600. He dropped the landing gear. The hydraulic system had enough residual pressure to lock the wheels down. He heard the gear thump into place. He reached for the flap handle and stopped himself. Flaps meant drag. Drag meant a steeper glide slope. Drag meant he would land in the sea 100 yards short of the round down. Gear down, flaps up, committed. 500 feet, half a mile. He could see the landing signal officer on the port side of Langley's flight deck. Yellow paddles in the LSO's hands. The paddles crossed high above the LSO's head. Wave off. McCampbell was too high, too fast, wrong approach angle. Every rule of carrier aviation demanded that he go around and try again. He had no engine to go around with. McCampbell ignored the LSO. He had nothing else to give the airplane. Physics was flying Minsi III now. Gravity and momentum, and the last few knots of airspeed. The LSO saw it in his eyes across 300 yards of open ocean. The LSO dove for the safety net. Minsi III crossed the round down at 50 feet, gear dangling, propeller windmilling, the fuselage barely clearing the aft edge of the flight deck by inches. She hit the deck hard. The oleos on the main gear compressed all the way to the stops. Steel groaned. Rubber bit into wood. The tail hook grabbed for the arresting wires and caught the number 3. The wire stretched. Minsi III decelerated from 90 knots to 0 in 3 seconds. 8 G-forces threw McCampbell forward into his harness. His head snapped against the headrest and back again. The engine quit the instant the tail hook caught the wire. Fuel starvation. Absolute and final. Somewhere deep in the R2800, the last drop of aviation gasoline finished its trip through the carburetor, and 18 cylinders had nothing left to burn. The Langley deck crew ran toward him. McCampbell sat in the cockpit. His hands were shaking. His flight suit was soaked through. His shoulders ached. His neck ached. His eyes hurt from 90 minutes of staring through a reflector sight into the sun. The deck crew tried to release the tailhook from the arresting wire. The hydraulic system had no pressure. The engine-driven pump was dead. 4 sailors had to physically lift the hook off the wire by hand. Rushing's Hellcat came over the round down 30 seconds later. Rushing caught the number 2 wire. His engine quit on the rollout. 2 dead Hellcats on the deck of Langley, both pilots alive, both aircraft empty. McCampbell unstrapped and climbed down from the cockpit. His legs almost gave out when they took his weight. A deck officer with a clipboard was waiting for him. McCampbell gave him the number, 9 confirmed. The deck officer wrote it down. An ordnance chief climbed onto Minsi III's wing. He opened each of the 6 ammunition bays and counted what was left. Port outboard, empty. Port center, empty. Port inboard, empty. Starboard inboard, empty. Starboard center, empty. Starboard outboard, 6 rounds, all 6 jammed in the feed chute. The fuel crew checked the tanks with a calibrated stick. Main tank, dry. Auxiliary tank, dry. Reserve tank, dry. The chief looked at the deck officer. The deck officer looked at McCampbell. McCampbell looked at Rushing, who was walking across the deck toward him with his flight helmet in his hand. Rushing had shot down 6 Japanese aircraft with his own guns that morning. 6. He would receive the Navy Cross for that morning's work, the 2nd highest decoration for valor in the United States military. He would fly out the war. He would live until 1986. He would die quietly with his family in the country he had helped save. Between them, McCampbell and Rushing had destroyed 15 enemy aircraft in 90 minutes. No other 2 Americans in the entire war would ever match that number in a single mission. Neither man said very much on the deck of Langley that afternoon. There was nothing left in either of them to say. Later that day, the war continued. It always did. Task Force 38 aircraft found Vice Admiral Kurita's center force in the Sibuyan Sea and put 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs into the battleship Musashi, 72,000 tons of Japanese steel, the largest battleship ever built. Musashi rolled onto her port side and sank at 7:30 that evening, taking more than 1,000 of her crew with her. The USS Princeton, still burning from the Lonam bomb hit that had opened the day, was scuttled by American torpedoes that afternoon. She had been struck by exactly 1 Japanese airplane out of the more than 150 Onishi had launched that day. One airplane had been enough. Everything else, every other Japanese aircraft that had come at Task Group 38.3 that morning, had been shot down, driven away, or forced to jettison and run. David McCampbell and Roy Rushing had done that.
2 men.
One decision, 90 minutes. McCampbell was not court-martialed for disobeying Rear Admiral Sherman's order. In January of 1945, in a ceremony at the White House, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt hung the Medal of Honor around David McCampbell's neck. The citation covered both the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June and the action over Task Group 38.3 on the 24th of October. He was the only fast carrier aviator of the entire war to receive that decoration for aerial combat. He finished the war with 34 confirmed aerial victories. He remains to this day the top ace of the United States Navy. He remains the top ace to survive the war on the American side. His single mission record of 9 kills has never been equaled by any American pilot in any war since. He stayed in the Navy. He commanded a carrier of his own. He retired as a captain in 1964 after 31 years of service. He lived out his years in Florida, gave the occasional interview, spoke at Naval Academy reunions, and refused, to the end, to describe himself as a hero. He died on the 30th of June, 1996, at the age of 86. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Minsi III, Bureau number 70143, was lost in an operational accident in December of 1944 with a different pilot at the controls. The Hellcat McCampbell flew that morning. The one whose engine died the second she landed on Langley exists today only in photographs and combat film, but an F6 F5 Hellcat painted in her exact markings sits under a spotlight at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. Dark navy blue, white stars, yellow letters spelling out the name Minsi III below the cockpit, and 34 small Japanese flags stenciled beneath the canopy rail, one for every enemy aircraft David McCampbell shot down between May and November of 1944. 9 of those flags are for the morning of October 24th, 2 pilots. 60 Japanese aircraft, 90 minutes, 6 rounds of jammed ammunition in the starboard outboard gun, not a drop of fuel in any tank, an engine that ran until the exact instant the tail hook caught the wire, and not 1 second longer. That is what one American pilot did when the alarm bell rang and someone had to answer it. His name was David McCampbell, and he came home.